And now I'd like to invite Planning Committee member Dana Alexander to join me. She will introduce the first of this year's 3 interactive panel on the impact of racism and institutional bias. Dana?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to introduce today our first panel session of this conference. We will be getting set up here momentarily. So this first panel session is Social Determinants of Health and Equity, the Impact of Racism and Institutional Bias. Our panelists today will be able to relate the impact of institutional racism and bias to the achievement of health equity. Our panelists will also speak to specific strategies that have been successful in combating institutional racism and bias, and they will discuss policy strategies that are very pertinent to the Academy's mission as well. So I'd like to go ahead then and introduce our panelists here today. Hopefully they are coming up to the stage. We have Bernie Lacey, and again, you can refer to your programs for more detail on their bios and their backgrounds. I think you will find they're very much experts in terms of what they will be speaking to here today. We also have with us today Tony Varelli and Patty Hiroho as well as our panelist speakers. And Jana Lauderdale is our moderator for this session as well. How the session will flow is as follows, is that Tony will speak, followed by Patty, followed then by Bernie. Jana, again, will function as the moderator. Each panelist will give their point of view for a few minutes. Then we will open it up for questions and answers. So once again, I encourage you to either submit your questions through the app or else use the cards that are on the tables as well. And Jana will moderate the session. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Jana. Thank you.
Whatever you want to do.
Making sure I had my marching orders down right. Good afternoon and welcome. We are going to have probably a very engaging and spirited talk this afternoon, discussion that I hope you will all participate in. The participants, actually our stage faculty are only going to be talking for about 5 minutes apiece. So they're going to give you sort of a quick and dirty rundown of what they do with many of the hats that they wear. So with that said, we are going to go ahead and get started because we have such a small amount of time and we want to allow time for questions and answers. So if you would, does anybody want to volunteer to start? Or?
I'm going to start.
Okay.
I'm going to start.
Dr. Villarreal, all right, please go ahead.
Yeah. Very pleased to be part of this panel, and again, congratulations to the Academy and the Planning Committee for addressing such a timely topic, and I know that one that is near and dear to many of us as nurses and certainly to my colleagues here on stage. We thought it would be helpful to start off the discussion with actual definitions of health equity as well as institutional racism and bias, and I do have a slide, so if we could put the first slide up. There you go. So I think we're all familiar with the term health equity, and I have a definition here that comes from Healthy People 2020. And health equity ensures that all people have full and equal access to opportunities that enable them to lead healthy lives. This is a concept that's based on social justice and fairness. It comes from a human rights perspective. And when we think about equity and health equity, this is more than just about health care. It is about recognizing, as our previous speaker did, that we care about the environment and the context in which people live, work, play, and pray. So importantly, though, health equity is a political priority, and it's a political process. And so to have health equity as part of Healthy People 2020, and you know that's evolved over time from addressing health disparities to, again, really looking at equity among groups, means that it is a priority that sets national policies. It's filtered down into local policies. It's part of many foundations. Certainly the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in the Culture of Health has made addressing social determinants and health equity a priority. And certainly within our institutions of schools of nursing, it is a priority. I'm very pleased that our faculty has made that a key driver of our mission, and that is to advance health equity. So when we think about other definitions that I wanted to make sure that we had a common understanding about were both racism and institutional bias. And the two are actually related. Racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities and unfairly advantages other individuals or communities. And so again, these issues, this can be both personal, it can be institutional, it can be unintentional, and it can be unintentional. Related to that is institutional bias, those established laws, customs, and practices which systematically reflect and produce group-based inequities in any society. So if we're thinking about health equity, the issues of addressing racism and institutional bias are key. We can't address the social determinants of health. We can't achieve health equity if we don't address racism and institutional bias. But let me give you some examples of how pervasive this is within our society. I have to tell you, I spent Tuesday morning with my colleague Betty Smith-Williams at the African American History Museum. And if I needed a primer for what I was going to talk about today, that certainly was a primer. Because throughout history, you can see our history of our country, the paradox of dealing with both freedom and justice, and the systematic oppression, not only of African Americans, but of Native Americans, of Mexican and Latino Americans. Look what's going on in Puerto Rico. So let me give you some example again of these standards of practice. And again, these are policy decisions that have been done deliberately to dehumanize and again, create these inequities. So of course, we take a look at slavery. We take a look at apartheid. We take a look at some of immigration policies that are happening not only now, but again, are cyclical. Immigration policies, for example, that deported a massive amount of Mexican Americans happened right during the Great Depression, when over 1 million Mexican Americans were deported to Mexico. They had never set foot in that country, but they were deported because, again, in the name of economic security, in the name of nationalism. So again, this is a cyclical component. When we think about the war of drugs that happened in the 70s in the Nixon administration, what's coming out in history is that that was a deliberate process by Nixon and his administration to suppress the protest against the wars, not only by African Americans, but also by hippies. And again, that legacy lives in today and is responsible for the mass incarceration of blacks and Latinos. So when you think of the inequities in sentencing policies between crack cocaine and powdered cocaine is again, one example. When you think about the work of the sheriff in Arizona, Joe Arpaio, who again took workplace raids and crime suppression sweeps in Arizona and treated those that he picked up so unfairly and unjustly. Again, these are policies. We also need to take a look at some of the marriage laws that exclude gays and lesbians from, again, those legal rights. Those are all policy decisions and very intentional. When we take a look at unintentional policies, we consider some policies around insurance policies, around workplace requirements, around educational opportunities. So again, to think that we as nurses, as nursing school deans, as people who teach, are immune from this type of institutional bias just isn't true. When we take a look at also, when we think about institutional bias, we think, well, gosh, haven't we made some really good progress? And we have. But I think one thing that I certainly have seen is that all of this is cyclical. So again, we might have had the Emancipation Proclamation, but what happened after that? Jim Crow. We had voting rights. What happened after that? Voting suppression. We had the Civil Rights Voting Act that, again, was supposed to alleviate. And what do we have? We have political gerrymandering. We ended segregation in schools, but introduced standardized tests, which we know still today unfairly bias against women and minorities. So again, these are all cyclical components. So as I said before, the issues of bias, of racism, and freedom are inextricably challenged. And I was so inspired by a number of things that I read yesterday, but I'm going to close my part for a little bit with a quote from Maya Angelou, who says that history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again.
Thank you.
You want me to go ahead and go?
And next, I think Patty Aurora is going to go next. So
It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. Currently, I'm serving as the CEO for OptumServe, and our focus is to serve our veterans, those that are serving on the military health side right now, and our service members, and then also those are Medicare beneficiaries. And the reason why I add that into the opening, because part of what I'm going to talk to you about is actually disparity with women veterans. And it started with my lens looking at it when I was on active duty as the Army Surgeon General, and it is now continuing into my current position as the CEO of OptumServe. And so when you go back and you kind of look in time, in 1942, and I'm not going to do a history lesson, but in 1942, a law was passed that allowed women to serve with the Army. And the reason why I brought that out is because that one small word, with, is very powerful. It didn't say they could serve in. And so when we look at disparity, I think we have to really focus on what are the small words that comes out in our policies and our legislation that may limit a certain gender or certain ethnicity, and that may cause a lack of service within the healthcare community. And so the law was changed, and it allowed women then to serve in the different services. And we now have 95% of the occupants, the jobs that are out there, women are serving in, and they're working towards that 100%. But with that, I have to tell you, I saw that we have a one-size-fits-all healthcare system or a model of care. And it really is based on a lot of research that has been done with men, and then we apply it to females. And this really came to light when I was deployed to Afghanistan in 2011. And when I was at night, I would sit and talk to a lot of the women that were deployed in theater. And I was just listening to their stories. And the stories that I heard were really stories that were so powerful, because it really shone a light of where we had, I think, in my opinion, not taken into account that females, we think differently, we deploy differently, we experience deployment differently, our symptoms for an illness show up differently than our male counterparts. And so from that, we came back and we developed a Women's Health Task Force. And we looked at every aspect of care to our female service members of all services. And then we stood up a women's health service line that allowed us to have that lens through every aspect of the provision of care. And so the transformation started occurring. It's an arduous task, and we're nowhere near complete. And what I would submit is we're nowhere near where we need to be in this commercial sector as well. Because if we could put up a slide, I'd like to show you. When you look at this slide, if I asked everybody to write down how many of those pictures are pictures of female veterans, How many are those of women who have never served? How many of those are women that are currently serving on active duty or maybe in the reserves or the National Guard? How many of you think you could pick out which one of those are veterans? Just raise your hand real quick. Nobody's hand went up. And the reason why I wanted to show this is right now, many of you are either treating veterans within your commercial entity, you're either educating them within your healthcare system and your education academic systems. And what we're not doing is we're not identifying females that are veterans, and we're not asking the question, did you serve? And if there's only two things you remember of what I've said today, I'd ask for you to remember those two things. And the reason why is that when we identify someone as serving as a veteran, we can then associate their experience and their exposures so that we could tailor their health care to really target the type of care that they need. But right now, we don't do that. And we already know that females are the fastest growing population, the veteran females, for homelessness in our country. And think about that. There are 22 million veterans serving today. 1.3 million veterans leave the service and go into the VA community every single year, so that population's growing. And right now, they're predicting in 2040 that 20% of the veterans will be females. So they are all over the United States, and every single one of us are touching a veteran's life. And if we know who they are, we can really tailor that care. I think institutional bias is being introduced on many, many levels, from our policies, from our lack of being able to pick out a female veteran, and I think we're missing opportunities for healing to occur. And one of the things that I noticed, so my father, who passed away in January, World War II veteran, Korea veteran, and a Vietnam veteran, and had macular degeneration and Parkinson from exposure to Agent Orange. But he would always wear his baseball cap that had the 3 wars on it. And no matter where we went, someone would come up and say, thank you for your service. And I watched him in his wheelchair. He would sit up a little bit taller when someone said that, and I watched the healing that would occur. There are females that are serving today that are in your institutions that we don't turn to them and say, tell me your story. We don't turn to them and say, thank you for the service. And we definitely don't look to say, is the behavioral health challenges that you're having, is that associated maybe with the deployment? Is the respiratory illness that you're having, is it because you were deployed and you were exposed to burn pits? We're not making those connections. And so I think we're not giving the best quality of care that we need to. 2.5 times, female veterans are 2.5 times more likely for risk of suicide than non-veteran women. They're also at a higher risk for mental health and substance abuse. Actually, 46% of women serving are at risk compared to 23% of men serving. And these disparities, I think, show up very differently just because of our gender differences. And so we need to be looking at how we educate and how we train our clinicians. We need to look at the research. Right now, the majority of research that we have on veterans all happen to be focused mainly on men. And it's just recently that we've been increasing the number of research that we have that are targeted at female veterans. And this is how we're finding out some of that data. And what we found out is that when you just look at a female combat veteran that redeploys back and is an amputee, their prosthesis does not fit as well as the male veterans. And so we're working right now in the current position that I'm in with DOD and the VA to actually come up with clinical practice guidelines that will help standardize that and have consistency across the board. So really, when we look at it, I think the thing that will help us as we look at trying to break down some of these barriers is focusing on research that's tailored and specific, that looks at the demographics, that incorporates their experiences, that looks at current models that are dependent on female research and the outcomes so that we have clinical practice guidelines that are consistent across the board. I think we need to be looking at the use of big data and individualize the relationship of the data with the woman and the veteran and the way that we deliver that care so that we have early prevention, detection, and that treatment is consistent. And probably the one story that I'd like to end with is when we look at some of the data that I talked about of females having a higher incidence for behavioral health. This story that I heard when I was in Afghanistan, I think really, to me, it enlightened and it changed the way that I looked at the care that we would deliver when I redeployed back. And I was talking to this one woman who was in the reserves, who was a mechanic on the attacked helicopter. And what she would do in that role was very vital to the mission in Afghanistan. And then she redeployed home, and she had 2 children, was married, and she said, I have to tell you, I struggled so much to reintegrate into my family. And she said, I felt like what I was doing at home was not as valuable, nor was it as important as what I was doing when I was deployed. And she said, my husband doesn't understand, and my children don't. And she said, and I have tremendous guilt. That right there is a different feeling that leads to behavioral health concerns. And what we have to be able to do is to realize that everyone experiences their service differently, but those stories and those experiences need to be factored into the model of care so that we move away from a one-size-fits-all model of care to a model of care that is not descriptive analytics, but predictive analytics that really has tailorable, scalable care that is directed at gender-specific and improving the health of our veterans. Because as they're willing to do so much for our country, we collectively should be willing to do so much for them. So thank you.
And now we'll hear from Dr. Bernie Lacey.
Good afternoon, and I want to take this opportunity to thank the Academy for bringing to us this critical conversation that I hope won't end with today. I'd like to make a statement first to say that pity and compassion in a world of pain mean nothing unless it leads to change. I want to relate to you today my own experience with racism. Think about a young woman, about 20 years old, who wanted badly to be a nurse. I am a native of Vicksburg, Mississippi, and I was admitted to nursing school in the late 50s at a school at Mississippi Baptist Hospital in Jackson, Mississippi, which is 40 miles from my home. At that time, of course, as all of you know, there was deep segregation. The class in which I was admitted, the program was described as a dual program. But the definition of dual at that time meant that they admitted both white students and colored students. At that time, we were colored. In my class, there were 64 white students who were seated in rows up front, and there was an imaginary line, and the 6 colored students sat in the back. At that time, I was addressed as Nurse Mays. The white students were addressed as Miss Smith or Miss Jones. Even though my experiences were at Mississippi Baptist Hospital, I could not enter the hospital through the front door. I could not eat in the cafeteria with my classmates. I ate in the kitchen with the kitchen help. At that time, this is all I knew of how people were treated. So understand me, that even though it may have been painful, I didn't know any other way. During that time, the hospital was designed so that there was an annex for colored patients called the Green Annex. But during my experience as a student, we were never assigned to treat or care for patients on the Green Annex. Primarily, now I understand it was because they did not wish the white students, young ladies, to be exposed to colored patients, nor particularly colored men. So the only opportunity I had to provide services to the colored patients was we were given 2 days off a week, and one of those days I could work. So I always elected to work on the Green Annex and care for those patients. When I graduated from Mississippi Baptist Hospital, I took a job at Tuskegee, Alabama. And during that time, my mother took sick. So I came home to care for my mother. As she improved in health, I said, well, maybe I'll try to get a job in Vicksburg. There were no colored registered nurses in my town. The physician taking care of my mother was a white physician, and I spoke with him, and I said, can you assist me in finding a job at the county hospital, which was located in my town? And he said, well, I'll go to the board of directors and see if they would be willing to employ you. And he did, and they employed me. The position that was available was as evening supervisor. So 6 of the white nurses resigned from the hospital because they hired me. The rumor around town became that I was coming there to integrate the hospital. That wasn't my reason at all. I was coming because I needed to work and I needed a job. So several months after receiving, after a while, a number of threats, one evening the hospital was divided into 2 sections. One section was for the acute care patients and the other section was for chronic patients, and there was a catwalk. And as I was crossing the catwalk one evening, someone took a shot at me. The police came and they said, well, we'll have to take you home, we'll take you home. They took me home, and when I got home, my mother had heard the news. She was packing my bag. She said, you've got to get out of town, they will kill you. So that began my journey from Mississippi to Washington, D.C. Now I know that some of you are sitting there and say, well, that was then, but this is now. But you heard that this is cyclical. And if any of you have had any time to listen to CNN or MSNBC, it's now. It's not then, it's now. When I read and heard about Charlottesville, that brought back some terrible memories for me. Terrible. I say, it's not gone. It just presents itself in different ways, but it's not gone. It's not gone because right here in Washington, D.C. today, 6 weeks ago, about 6 weeks, one of the major hospitals providing services to African American patients in particular closed its obstetrics unit. About 2 weeks ago, another major hospital in Washington closed its obstetrics unit. Now, in speaking with the people in charge of health, they say, oh, there are plenty of OB beds in Washington. Yes, I said, there are plenty of beds. But tell me how those women in wards 7 and 8 are going to get to where those beds are located, which is in the central part of Washington, many of them not particularly happy to have those clients. Tell me how those women will have transportation and access to getting to OB services. Tell me how the next hospital that has closed, how those women, that population where that hospital is situated is primarily Hispanic. And many of the OB services, physicians providing services or others providing service don't accept Medicaid. So we've got a problem. Things about talking about access and the social determinant, that has a lot of, that will present to us a lot of things to think about. Access is one of those particular things in talking about providing services. You heard Mr. Smith when he's saying how important safe births are. What's going to happen to these women? And what's going to happen to these children who will begin life, not quality life at all? What's going to happen to them? So this morning, I got a telephone call from a physician friend of mine who knows, that I'm a social activist. And he called and said, "You're going to be happy to hear this. So when you give your talk today, you tell those nurses how brave they are, because the persons now standing up to what has happened in Washington," he told me, "are the nurses." So I'm so pleased and grateful to hear that it's nurses who are coming out front and presenting to the health commissioner. You don't have any plan. What plan do you have for these women? So the nurseries, of course, not only did the OB unit close, but it meant the nurseries closed. So it's not over. Cyclical, yes. It's coming back in different ways, not coming back, but it's continuing in different ways. So I had to tell you this story today because it's still painful for me. It's still painful for me to know that it seems that I'm going to live this thing over again. The climate in this country is not good. It's toxic. The climate in our country is toxic. So I want to end with saying something to you, because I told you nurses are standing up in the district. But change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. These words were spoken by our former president, Barack Obama.
Thank you all for your inspiring words and your long remembrances. And we can certainly see how those kinds of issues, as you said, are still going on. They're just taking a different format. So at this point, we would like to let the audience ask questions. If you'll fill out your cards, and someone will pick them up from your table and bring them up to me. The first one is for Lieutenant Colonel Herrero. How can nurses prevent or close the gap that occurs as women transition from active duty to veteran status?
Say the question again.
How can nurses prevent or close the gap that occurs as women transition from active duty to veteran status?
I think, I believe nurses have the most powerful roles in our nation right now, because I think you have the ability to really help people move towards health. And if you have health, then you're able to be productive in industry, in society, and in your personal life. And so what I would submit for nurses in focusing with our veterans is to take your influence and really extend it into what I call the life space. And it's everywhere outside of the bricks and mortars of our healthcare system or our academic system. It's really into that space where people make decisions on how they live, labor, and love. And as you extend that influence, you allow a female veteran to be able to transition into the next role that they're going to be doing. And it's focusing on their physical, their psychological, their spiritual, and their emotional health, and really looking at all of those health determinants that will allow them to be much more productive within society.
Thank you. Dean Villarreal, what practical steps can individual members of the Academy take to increase our knowledge and ability to recognize and work to change systems, to reduce institutional racism, and create inclusive commonalities?
Sure. I think within whatever setting you're at, I think is again recognizing that there is bias, and then recognizing to figure out how that affects the outcomes that you desire, whether it's from increasing diversity within your school to improving health in the communities that you serve. It's again trying to figure out what the issues are and how those other factors work there. I think it's critically important that the issues of health equity, social determinants, decreasing racism and institutional bias is something that we all embrace, and that we embrace as a profession. You hear that it's a public health agenda, but I would love to hear that it's a nursing agenda, that it's something that we embrace and we move forward. I think nurses have done this work for many years in many different ways, but we don't get the recognition. And I think we have to take it, and I think we have to own it. And we certainly have the ability, as you described, Bernie, to be able to move that forward. And then I think it's important that we partner with communities. I mean, this isn't just our issue, but I think partners with people across multiple sectors in different ways. I like to say sometimes we might be driving the car, sometimes it's supporting the communities and driving the car and the destiny that they want to be able to do. But it's creating those partnerships and moving forward.
Thank you. This one is for Dr. Lacey. Dr. Lacey, we are aware that the news is reporting the moving or dismantling of Confederate statues across the U.S., and there seems to be differing opinions among the African American community as to how this is being interpreted. Do you believe these actions will serve to, and I quote the media, heal old wounds?
Heal old wounds. I'm not here to give a history lesson, but let me just say to you that, many of these statues were not erected until after the Civil War. And they were sponsored and paid for by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they really those statues, most of them are generals, General Lee and some of those other folks. But for some folks in this country, they're still fighting the Civil War. And, there's that saying, save your Confederate money, the South will rise again. That's not just a joke. That's not just a joke. Charlottesville should tell us something. When I look around, I now live out in Maryland on the Eastern Shore. And I have seen now the men in their trucks with the Confederate flags in the back and their gun racks in the back. And it's as if they're empowered now to demonstrate this kind of thinking. If you paid close attention at the pictures at Charlottesville, you saw a little boy, I think it was a boy, toddler, with a Ku Klux Klan outfit on. So what is this telling us? What is this saying? So are they raising another generation to have these thoughts? So I don't have the answers. I have the pain, but I don't have the answers. But I think that together we could come up with what do we do? What are the strategies that we need to employ? But I'm hoping that the Academy pays close attention to this conversation now, because I do believe that nursing can have the answers and can make the change. But it's all of us working together. And I would want to employ, you know, we have the National Black Nurses Association, we have the National Hispanics, we have the National. We need to bring these organizations together too.
Okay.
Because we all have the same goal in mind. And I think there's strength in numbers. So we can be the change that this nation needs. But we've got to put our hearts and heads together to do it. So I don't have the answer to the question, but I would like to pose some thinking about what you said.
Thank you very much. This is for Lieutenant Colonel. What can the Academy do to promote funding for research for women veterans issues?
That's a great question. There is the TSNRP, which is a tri-service nursing research program that will accept funds so that there is research that is specific to military, research that's specific to female veterans and also to male veterans and service members currently serving. And so, you know, actually I was talking to someone outside in the lobby right before we came in, and she said, you know, 2020 is coming up, and maybe we should look at seeing our veterans differently and looking and focusing on, you know, basically on eye health and kind of widening our lens. And what I would submit when we look at the research, I think the Academy should take on some of the top health issues that are challenges to our veterans. I think behavioral health is one of them. I think opiate addiction is another one that's not just our veterans, but it's a national issue. I believe nurses can help change that as we look at complementary alternative medicine and overall total health and well-being. And I think if we use those research dollars to really target specific research that then can be tailored to the provision of care for our veterans, but then also applicable to a national application of the findings of that research.
Thank you. Dean Villarreal, as nurse leaders, how can we initiate the discussions about institutional bias?
Well, I think this is a great start here. This is a discussion at a great national organization, but I think having those discussions in the classrooms, in our professional groups are all critically important. I think we have to write about it. I think we have to be visible about it. And again, not just in talking to ourselves, but in talking with our legislators and talking with our community groups, because they need to know how we as a profession, you know, both our history, our legacy, and again, how we're ready to partner in moving forward with that. So we have to be more visible politically, and more visible in the communities that we serve, more visible in the neighborhoods in which we live.
I think I hear you saying we have to be more intentional with what we are needing to do. Talk can go on for a long time, but until we have intentional applications, it's difficult to make those differences.
Let me just give you an example. The Academy received money from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and we partnered with RAND Corporation to examine edge runners and how they actually advanced a culture of health. The culture of health is a big movement from RWJ, and sometimes it looks like they just invented it, when nurses have been at the forefront of this for a long time. And that the work that we did with our current edge runners was a way of demonstrating that nurses, in fact, have the expertise to be able to do that. We are the solution, but we're just not recognized for that component. So again, fabulous work going on in our profession by many individuals and communities in many sectors, but we're just not getting the word out. So we absolutely need to do a better job. And certainly one of the issues around the sustainability of some of these edge runner models that are both cost-effective, evidence-based, is that we haven't been successful in moving the political process. And we're not going to do that as a profession by ourselves. We can only do that if we partner again with the communities and people that we tend to want to serve.
Thank you. This is for Dr. Lacey. How do minority nursing students deal with isolation in an all-white cohort?
I'm sorry?
How do minority nursing students deal with isolation in an all-white cohort of students?
Okay, so the nursing students are African-American nursing students? And how do they deal with that?
I think they're saying that they isolate themselves and, yes.
Well, I had to deal with that, of course, in terms of my white classmates, because many times there were social activities that were planned for them, but we were not invited, of course, to those activities, so we had to create our own. At that time, remember that this was, all of us, this was how we grew up. We knew the divisions between, like in the hospital, for me to go to the bathroom, I had to go to the bathroom labeled colored. There was a white women and then colored bathroom. So that we made those adjustments because we knew that's the way that it was. And we didn't have any recourse to complain to anybody about it. Who was going to listen? This was the way life was for you. I think we were supported and given support by our mothers and our friends. My mother used to say to me, what you have to do is get this education, and then you can make a decision about leaving here and going somewhere else. I wish I had the money for every time I went in the linen closet and cried because some white patient had called me names and had denigrated me and disrespected me, but who could I tell? There was nobody there that was going to defend me. The instructors would often go to the patients and say, oh, she's a student nurse. Because many times the patients, the white patients, even though I had on the same uniform as my colleagues, my white colleagues, they thought I was the kitchen help and that I was bringing their dinner trays. And when they said, oh, no, this is the nurse, they refused to have me care for them. So certainly, I'm human, it was painful. So we had to make our own distractions and times to be away. And we had to support each other. We had to talk these things out oftentimes so that we could have the strength to go back another day and try. So my direction and my focus really at that time was get out of here. Get out of here. So, you know, I was trying to save myself. And that's how I feel that probably others were doing the same.
Thank you.
So I would like to add, so if in case that question came up from some students that were here, is that I believe that if you were recruited to a school and they want you, that there will be some sympathetic or some supportive faculty members, students, and student group that would help you navigate not only the system, but help you address some of those issues. So you have the faculty, you have students outside of your school, you have, again, in the broader university, other student groups, again, who are addressing similar concerns or again, need to help you navigate. There's professional organization, Black Nurses Association, other Minority Nurses Association, again, where you can find the comfort and courage and strength as well as support to be able to address those issues there. But I'd like to believe if you were recruited to a school that there would be some great faculty and students that would help you navigate that, because it's not just about getting out, it's about surviving and being able to, for you to be able to thrive in that environment.
Right. Yes, I believe our students, we have mentoring, a program where they're paired with a second-year student when they come in as a first-year student. And then when those students finish with the year, then those first-year students pay it forward and mentor another student coming in. So they always have someone that they know that they can talk to and get information from. And a lot of times it's just nice to have a friendly face that they can speak with and say, did you have this much reading when you were here? That kind of thing. It's comforting, I think. So there's a lot of strategies that are out there. I think that they have to be tailored to your, particular situations. But they do tend to work with the right oversight and the right support. So I know that they can be successful. It does take some work and willing students to participate in those kinds of activities, but they do work. Thank you. General Haroro, can you speak about how care disparities look like when we focus on transgender female veterans compared to their cisgender counterparts?
Let me make sure. So can I tell you what it looks like if there's disparity between transgender and, I couldn't hear the last part. And
compared to their cisgender counterparts.
Okay. So I think a couple things. And I started thinking about it when y'all were making your comments. One of the things when in the military a couple years back when the president made a policy change and revoked Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And people were really worried about how was the Army going to do now that we were going to, have gay and lesbians. And I have to tell you, they've been serving their entire time in the history of our country. They have, okay? And so when people looked and said, how difficult is that going to be? It wasn't difficult at all. And I have to tell you the reason why I believe it wasn't difficult is that people find the common bond, and it goes to this question. The common bond or the common element is that we're soldiers. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. It doesn't matter if you're LBGT and now IA. It doesn't matter what your ethnicity and your culture is. The common bond is that we're soldiers and we've raised our hand to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And so as we started working about 3 years ago, it's probably now been almost 4 years ago, about integration of transgenders and the different policies within the military, I think you all would be very proud of your military, Army, Navy, and the Air Force at the strategic level, because I sat through about 1.5 years of those discussions before I retired. People were pretty open-minded. We're looking and saying, how do we make this work? What are the issues? How do we accommodate? How do we keep people at a high level of readiness? Because there's different factors politically within the military than there is out in the civilian sector with that. And so I think when you see disparities that are out there, to me it would be if someone calls out and believes that that soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine is different because of their sexual orientation. And if they believe they're different because of that, they then stop seeing them as a service member and they're seen through a lens of prejudice. And to me, when someone does that, it undermines the fabric of our military service and of our country. And so, I think the thing that we have to be very careful about is that we have to understand where our common grounds are. And then we have to have our own personal insight into where our personal biases are and make sure that those personal biases don't reflect on the individuals that we're interacting with. And so I think we have a long way to go in our country, but I have to tell you, I was just at the University of Pittsburgh because I sit on their board of trustees. And we were getting an update from the students, and it was on their LBGTIA, and IA was new for me, and the A stands for ally. And what they were describing was the education courses that they're giving, and that the certificates that they're giving to instructors that they then put outside the door of those that have taken the class and have a increased understanding of the needs of that population. And then they're having more male and females actually going to some of those courses. And so the one thing that I said to them is, how do we ensure that as we try to be very sensitive to all the different uniquenesses of individuals that are pursuing an education, that we don't swing the pendulum and that we cause a bias for those that maybe haven't learned to be sensitive to a certain population. And I think that's with anything in life. We have to be very careful and we have to be very sensitive. So I don't know if I answered the question, but I do want to leave you with, you would be very proud of your military and how well they work together and how they work to rise above what are the social conversations that seem very spirited and sometimes very hateful outside. When it comes down to serving your country and willing to die for our flag, I could tell you there's not a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine who cares what the gender, the sexual preference or orientation, or their ethnicity of the soldier on their right or their left. They care about that they're Americans. And I think that's what we should be proud of.
We've only got time for one more quick question, and I'll just open it to the three of you to see who'd like to answer this one. Can any of you comment on ageism as part of this national discourse?
Not me, I'm too young.
Just a second, we're going to tee it up and then we'll go down. So ageism on...
Can any one of you comment on ageism
Yeah.
as part of this national discourse?
I'll do it from a veteran.
Yeah, sure.
Because we actually have found that we, as we've done a lot of research that's out there in looking at trying to make improvements for our female veterans and service members, we're actually doing a better job with our younger than we are with those that are aging. And I think it is a national conversation on how we treat, how we evaluate, how we diagnose women in our healthcare systems. I think we need to be very sensitive to how we display symptoms in different stressors and illnesses that are out there. And I think we should have consistent practices that really has age, demographics, ethnicity as the way that we deliver care. And so as we look at ageism, could maybe be the first that we look at, but I believe with the data that we have out there, that we as nurses should be driving and leading the change across this country in tailor-specific health care. And I think we can do that with our elderly, and I think we can then target each one of the demographics on where we want to decrease the disparities that's out there and improve overall health.
No, I agree with what you're saying because I am one of the elderly now. And, and I know how I would like to be treated. And so I've become more sensitive to age as I've grown older and recognized some of those, the deficits, as well as some of our attributes. So I think that at looking at those of us who are aging, don't disregard some of our attributes. And I think we want to be recognized for some of those. So I think that's important. It's not just our physical disabilities or the things that come with us physically, but our brain. I don't know how close to dementia I am, but some say, you know, with age comes wisdom. So recognize me for my wisdom and not just for my fact that I'm carrying a cane.
Let me just add one thing. So since 60 is the new 30, I think we have to relook at again what our perspective of aging is, and certainly look at policies that prevent people from interacting and living lives as productive as they want to in the workplace or any other place.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panelists for their wonderful insights and their stories of courage and trials and tribulations, and their wonderful insights for the call to action that, again, I think we need to take as nurses and address some of these issues that are knocking on our doors and then sometimes breaking the doors down. So I urge you all to think about this, look at your curriculums, look at the activities you have your students doing, and try to incorporate as much as you can. I thank you all for participating. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but you may be able to catch one of the speakers out in the hallway. You might ask them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.